1969. The world was paralyzed as Cold War tensions deepened. Fear was a daily reality as nuclear tensions escalated between the distinct communist and free nations. To Americans, the Soviet Union and People's Republic of China were the ultimate symbol of evil and oppression. Communism was threatening to enslave the free world. The world was astonished when President Richard Nixon, who had built his entire political career attacking communism, made a friendly visit to China in 1972. This radical shift in relations between the US and China posed a direct threat to the Soviets. It pressured the Soviets to sign the previously stalled Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty and the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, the first ever limits on nuclear weapons. Nixon's policy, what he called triangular diplomacy, played on Sino-Soviet tensions to break the impasse. The innovative strategy initiated a new era of détente. The Cold War was a prolonged struggle between capitalism and communism. America entered into conflicts over the expansion of communism, such as the Korean and Vietnam Wars. Americans felt it was imperative that communists be contained. As the Soviets came to power, conflicts arose directly with the Americans. The nuclear arms race between the US and Soviets was constantly escalating. The Cuban Missile Crisis brought the real threat of nuclear annihilation into stark focus. The development of intercontinental ballistic missiles in the mid-60s and the Soviet stalling of strategic arms limitation talks heightened the sense of terror around the Soviets. Something had to be done to turn the tide. In 1969, Richard Nixon was elected President of the United States. He had built his career by capitalizing on the communist hysteria of the McCarthy era. His prosecution of Alger Hiss in 1949 brought Nixon into the spotlight. As vice president under Eisenhower in 1952, he demonstrated strength in foreign affairs. He made history in the 1959 kitchen debate with Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. At the time of his inauguration, Nixon was an established icon of anti-communism. Nixon made foreign policy a cornerstone of his presidency. It would become his passion and pride. His national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, became Nixon's right-hand man, taking controls of responsibilities usually reserved for the Secretary of State. Together, they endeavored to create the most groundbreaking policies of the enduring Cold War. Just months after taking office, Nixon formed a radical plan to deal with the Soviets. America must open relations with Communist China. The United States had been a long-time enemy of China since Mao Zedong's takeover in 1949 and the defeat of the nationalists. He brought China into a state of self-induced isolation. The Cultural Revolution was used to combat Western influence, destroying the art, history, and ideas of old China to bring it into a modern era. It reinforced a militant rule over the nation and killed political rivals and protesters of communist rule. The defeated nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek fled to Taiwan, where they continued to receive US support. America refused to recognize the People's Republic as a legitimate nation and defended the claims by the Taiwanese. Relations between the two continued to decline due to China's intervention in the Korean War and its sponsorship of the North Vietnamese. In the eyes of the American people, China and the Soviet Union were paired as one communist threat against America. However, in actuality, Sino-Soviet relations had grown extremely hostile by 1969. That summer, over 400 separate skirmishes occurred between the two countries along the highly contested border they shared. To Nixon, war between these two communist superpowers seemed inevitable. In a bold departure from the decades of unquestioned foreign policy, Nixon proposed a twist, a policy he called triangular diplomacy. He planned to use China and America's mutual animosity against the Soviets to open a relationship with China. Even a potential Sino-American relationship will pose a threat to the Soviets. Nixon believed he could use this fear to pressure the Soviets into arms limitation talks. Beginning dialogue with China proved to be harder than expected. Nixon first needed a way to contact the isolated nation, which had recently terminated talks in Warsaw, Poland, the last form of communication between the nations. In December 1969, the US sent a message to the Chinese at a fashion show in Warsaw, expressing Nixon's desire to reopen talks between the nations. In April of '71, Sino-American relations lightened when the American ping pong team traveled to China. The Chinese used this event to soften relations between the two nations. It was a huge media sensation as Americans watching from their TVs became entranced by the ping pong diplomacy. No significant relations were established, but the event was the first cultural exchange between the two nations since communist rule. Just 1 month after ping pong, the United States received an invitation from Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai. It invited the United States to send an envoy to China in order to make arrangements for a later visit by Nixon. It was the breakthrough Nixon needed. While on a casual tour of Asia, Kissinger stopped in Pakistan to meet with President Yahya Khan. At dinner, Kissinger feigned an illness and supposedly stayed in Pakistan to recover. Not even the Secretary of State knew Kissinger was secretly boarding a plane to China. During the covert operation, codenamed Polo 1, Kissinger met with Premier Zhou Enlai. They discussed the future Sino-American relations and, of course, the ongoing issue of Taiwan. Nixon knew how important Taiwan was to the Chinese. Kissinger expressed America would be willing to take steps away from the island. They would be willing to lose an ally to gain a more important one. Most importantly, Zhou and Kissinger constructed an agreed-upon statement which was issued by Nixon in a televised address to the nation.
The People's Republic of China has extended an invitation to President Nixon to visit China. President Nixon has accepted.
February 1972, Nixon made history as the first US president to visit China. On his first night in China, he met with Chairman Mao, a meeting that even upon his arrival, Nixon was unsure would happen. This moment signified an enormous shift in relations as longtime enemies met face to face. Nixon's visit to China was significant because it represented a bond between the world's most powerful and the world's most populous nation. This relationship threatened to leave the Soviets behind. By the end of the week, the Shanghai Communique was jointly issued, stating a commitment to furthering relationships between the two nations. It avoided the volatile issue of Taiwan. By the end of Nixon's visit, vital groundwork had been laid for a future Sino-American alliance. Immediately after the visit, Kissinger was invited to Moscow to reopen strategic arms limitation talks. In May, Nixon and Soviet leader Brezhnev signed 10 formal agreements, including the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty and an interim Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. They were the world's first limit on nuclear weapons. They proved that nuclear weapons could be peacefully contained. Nixon's strategy was a game changer. He was innovative by leaving his political base and pursuing relations with a communist nation. His strategy of triangular diplomacy played on Sino-Soviet tensions to force the Soviet Union to re-enter into nuclear limitation talks and also formed a relationship with China. Nixon was able to recognize that when China entered into the world, it became one of the most important nations in the future. Nixon ended China's isolation to the world. By 1979, definitive diplomatic relations were established between China and America. Currently, the two nations have one of the closest economic relationships in history. The United States is the highest consumer of Chinese goods, importing over 17% of China's almost $2 trillion of exports. While the thought of a world without China is unheard of today, a world with China was unheard of before Nixon. The opening of China is the most innovative foreign policy in the modern era.